A monk rises before the sun on a small island off the English coastline. He has called this place home for 2 decades. He will not survive to see the afternoon. He has no way of knowing this. Neither do any of the others around him. The date is June 8, 793 AD. The monastery sitting on the island of Lindisfarne is a treasure in the truest sense. Gold crosses, jeweled manuscripts, and silver chalices fill its halls. Monks have worshipped and worked here without incident since 635 AD, nearly a century and a half of unbroken peace. There are no guards, no fortifications, and no soldiers within days of the island. Violence has never found this place. That changes before breakfast. 3 vessels emerge from the horizon, their dark sails visible against the morning sky. Dozens of oars slicing the water in practiced rhythm. Carved wooden serpents crown the front of each hull, eyes hollow, staring ahead. The men aboard carry axes, round shields, and iron swords. They have not stumbled upon this island by chance. They know what is stored inside that monastery. They also know that nobody is standing watch over it. The ships hit the shallows shortly after dawn. Armed men storm ashore and advance without breaking stride. Doors are smashed open. A monk gripping a wooden cross is cut down in the entrance before he can raise a word of protest. Gold is torn from altars. Silver is forced into leather sacks. Manuscripts that took scholars entire lifetimes to produce are tossed aside. Only the metal on their bindings has any value to these men. By midday, the island is quiet. Smoke rises from scorched buildings. The tide pulls blood from the sand. The ships are already gone, vanished back into the open North Sea. Nobody in England knows where these raiders came from. Nobody understands why this particular island was chosen. And not a single person alive that morning grasps what is truly significant about what just happened. This was not a random act of brutality. It was an opening move, and it was only the beginning. The warriors who sacked Lindisfarne came from no mighty empire. They had no cities, no written language, and no centralized government. They came from the harsh northern edges of Europe, a coastline so unforgiving that agriculture alone could not sustain a family through the year. The growing season barely stretched 4 months. What farmable land existed had already been claimed by chieftains who passed it to their eldest sons. A second son received nothing of consequence. A third son was barely considered worth naming, so they built ships instead. What they produced was unlike anything else in the known world. A single Viking longship could carry 70 warriors across open ocean, navigate rivers shallow enough to ford on foot, and still be light enough for 8 men to hoist overland and launch into the next waterway. No military force could anticipate where such vessels might surface, because the honest answer was, anywhere. For years, the raiding had been internal. Norse crews targeting Danish settlements, Danish crews pressing into Swedish territory. But by the late 700s, word had traveled back through Scandinavian ports about an island to the southwest. England. Its monasteries were overflowing with gold and silver. Its kingdoms were fractured. 4 or 5 rival rulers too consumed with fighting one another to bother securing their own shorelines. And it was reachable within days given favorable winds. Lindisfarne was not a spontaneous attack. It was a deliberate test. England failed spectacularly. The year after Lindisfarne, raiders struck Jarrow. The year after that, they hit Scotland, then Ireland, then trading settlements along the English Channel. The pattern locked in. Ships arrived each spring when calm seas allowed crossing. Raids ran through summer targeting ports and monasteries, and by autumn, the crews had departed with everything portable aboard. England had no navy, no coastal defenses, and no king with enough authority to unify a national response. 4 rival kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, each waited for the others to deal with the problem. So the raids grew larger and bolder. By the 830s, Viking fleets were arriving in dozens rather than 3s and 4s. They struck London in 842, burning much of the city and withdrawing before any army could assemble. Then, in the 850s, Viking crews stopped sailing home for winter entirely. They were building camps, learning the landscape, and identifying which English kingdoms would resist and which would fold. The English mistook what they were watching for increasingly aggressive raids. They were not raids, they were rehearsals. In the autumn of 865 AD, the largest fleet England had ever witnessed landed on the eastern coast. The men stepping off those ships carried no intention of stealing treasure and leaving. They had come to conquer and remain. This was a coordinated invasion force. Thousands of warriors drawn together from across Scandinavia with horses, supplies, and the collective resolve to stay as long as necessary. They struck a deal with the East Anglian king almost immediately, receiving horses and provisions in exchange for a temporary peace. It was not peace. It was preparation. The following spring, they rode north. Northumbria was convulsed by an internal power struggle between 2 rival claimants to the throne. and the Vikings arrived while both armies were still occupied with each other. York, the most important city in northern England, fell with little resistance. Northumbria collapsed within a year. East Anglia came next. The same king who had supplied them with horses attempted resistance and was executed for it. Mercia fell city by city until its king abandoned the country altogether. By 871 AD, 3 of England's 4 kingdoms had been either conquered or destroyed. Every major settlement north of the River Thames answered to Viking authority. Only Wessex remained, and its elderly king had just died, passing the crown to his 21-year-old youngest brother, a young man with no military record who had spent most of his life studying scripture and reading Latin texts. For 7 years, he did something nobody expected. He survived. He fought small engagements, signed temporary truces, and paid silver when there was no other option, losing ground gradually but never collapsing entirely. Then, in the winter of 878 AD, a surprise assault on his stronghold at Chippenham during the Christmas feast shattered what remained of Wessex. He escaped into the Somerset marshes with a handful of loyal men, hiding in fog and shallow water while his kingdom surrendered around him. But from that marsh, he sent word out. Riders carried his message to every corner of Wessex, summoning free men to a rallying point called Egbert Stone. He had no guarantee anyone would respond. They came anyway. Farmers, craftsmen, minor lords, and ordinary men who had been waiting in their villages for confirmation that the fight was not finished. 7 weeks later, his reassembled army broke the Viking line at the Battle of Edington. After 2 weeks of siege, the Viking force surrendered. A treaty divided England in two. The north and east became the Danelaw, while the south and west remained Saxon. The young man who had hidden in a swamp became the only English ruler in history to be called Alfred the Great. For 40 years, 2 separate cultures shared one island. In the Saxon south, churches stood, Latin was preserved, and communities lived under familiar traditions. In the Danelaw, Norse settlers had brought their own laws, their own religion, and their own way of life. Villages that had once answered to English lords now operated under Scandinavian customs, where a man's standing was determined by the testimony of his neighbors rather than the name of his father. The two worlds gradually bled together. Saxon traders learned enough Norse to do business in York. Danish farmers married local women and raised children in the Christian faith. Old English vocabulary absorbed hundreds of Scandinavian words, sky, knife, window, that remain embedded in the English language today. The coexistence was uneasy, and both sides understood it could not hold indefinitely. Alfred's children and grandchildren did not intend to accept half a country. His son began the slow, methodical reclamation of Danelaw territory, town by town, fortress by fortress. His daughter, who had married the Lord of Mercia, refused to step aside when her husband died. She took personal command of Mercian forces, oversaw the construction of defensive fortifications, and led campaigns against Viking strongholds across the Midlands. Medieval chroniclers recorded her victories the same way they recorded those of any king. Together, brother and sister compressed the Danelaw year by year until, in 927 AD, Alfred's grandson marched into York, the final major Viking stronghold on English soil, and claimed it without a battle. For the first time in history, a single ruler held authority from the Scottish border to the English Channel. England as a unified nation did not exist before the Viking invasions. It was a collection of quarreling kingdoms that rarely cooperated on anything. The crisis that came close to extinguishing all of them was precisely what compelled them to become one country. The fire that nearly destroyed Saxon England was also what forged it into something that could last. A nation hammered into shape, not by diplomacy or careful planning, but by 273 years of raids, invasions, marshes, and blood.